Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, and the time has come again for us to start talking about the very exciting ideas of what could be arriving in Total War Warhammer 3 with the upcoming, as of yet, unnamed DLC that's going to be featuring Khorne, the Greenskins, and the Ogre Kingdoms, which is a DLC that I was always deeply hoping for, and even talked about would be a really good idea, I think about a year and a half or 2 years ago. So, you know, I still got it, but I didn't actually expect that we were going to get it. So I am very pleased to see that it's on its way down the chute, and we'll be talking a lot about it in different ways and facets through the coming weeks. But today, to start off our little series of discussing this DLC, I wanted to just start with one of the things that people enjoy the most, which is, of course, speculation about what's going to be in it. And today we're going to be focusing on Khorne. Now, for the sake of keeping the videos to not be insanely long, and to try and make sure that we have plenty of things to talk about in the coming days and weeks, instead of going like super hard into every single potential aspect, for this one, I'm going to mostly focus on what I think the best units and things to just be in it very plain and simply would be and why. And then from there, I'll do another video in the coming days where we'll dive more into potential mechanics, potential rework ideas, and all those kinds of things. So like today, for instance, I'm going to tell you who I think the Legendary Lord should be, the Legendary Hero, who the free LC character should be, if Khorne gets the free LC character. But I'm not going to delve super hard into what they're going to do and what their mechanics will be. I'm going to save that for another video in the coming days where we'll talk very specifically about who the character is, their background, and all that other stuff. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and see what the Blood God likely, or possibly, has coming down the chute. So, Khorne is a pretty interesting case among these three factions of the Ogre Kingdoms, Greenskins, and Khorne, because, to be frank, he's not really missing a lot. There's only two things that are you can really, I think, look at and go, oh no, those should definitely be in. But everything else tends to get really fuzzy really quick because Khorne is not a super complex roster in the first place. And in the second place, he debatably got some of the most love with the initial base game for Warhammer 3 and has quite a few things. There's a lot going for Khorne. He's already been quite heavily expanded beyond his original remit, so to speak. I mean, you could argue the same for Slaanesh as well, who we'll hopefully see a DLC for in the future. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about, I think I feel pretty confident that I have been able to figure out what they're going to do for almost everything. There's one unit slot left open that I'm kind of like, about. Being that we're going to assume that they're going to be using the same formula that they did for Shadows of Change and Thrones of Decay, which is one Legendary Lord, one Legendary Hero, 5 units, and a generic Lord and a generic Hero, because that's a really good system, and they seemed really happy with that system, so I'm going to hope they keep repeating it. So, without further ado, let's start with the Legendary Lord. I feel like the Legendary Lord for this one is going to be painfully obvious, and that it's going to be Arbaal the Undefeated. I don't think anyone else is even close to having an opportunity to challenge him. For those unaware, Arbaal the Undefeated was introduced, well, maybe not necessarily introduced, I'm pretty sure he was introduced back with the Champions of Chaos book, way back in time. And he is, quite frankly, Khorne's most favored mortal warrior. Now, you may look at that and squint and go, wait, well, I thought like Volkio was his most favored, or or one of the many other characters, because there's so many Khorne mortal characters. And to which I would say, you're probably not entirely wrong, but this is before Volkio existed. Arbaal, though, is said to be the most favored champion of Khorne. And to be fair, he has the legacy and the storyline to back it up, where Arbaal, the Undefeated, has genuinely been a warrior who has not been defeated in battle for thousands of years. Arbaal has been around for a really long time, and the whole gimmick behind his identity is that many thousands of years ago, I want to say like probably like 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. Arbaal was this great and mighty champion of Khorne who fought his way across notable portions of the north. And, he like dipped down every once in a while into parts of the old world and wandered off to some other places. But eventually, as he was fighting his way across the world, he got bored. He got extremely bored. And by this point, he had already proven himself to Khorne enough that he had risen up as a mighty champion. And Khorne gave him 2 gifts. The first is known as the Hound of Khorne, which is a giant flesh hound. Like, we're talking at least as big as Khorne, which also, for anyone that hasn't seen the news, very excitingly, it sounds like patch 5.1 is going to be coming out on the 25th, I believe, and is going to be featuring Khorne as, the big new free thing that's going to be coming with it. Yes, it is on the 25th. So Khorne will be coming to everybody's game for free on the 25th, which will be very, very exciting for Khorne players. And I think maybe Warriors of Chaos, but at least Khorne. And, but in any event, so this is before Khorne existed as well, because the Fleshhound that is ridden by Arbaal is said to be Khorne's personal hound, like the creature that is, the top of the food chain when it comes to the Fleshhounds of the Blood God. Now, I would say that Khorne is someone who has co-opted that position since, but we can, I think, still argue that this unnamed hound is still maybe the largest of its breed, because it's big. Arbaal's a really big guy, and he looks like it's a monstrous beast-sized mount. It's up there with like your demigryphs, your Mournfang riders, all that other stuff where you have these really big, like it's larger or on par at least with a juggernaut of Khorne. It's a big dog. So he rides on one of the more favored hounds of the Blood God, which serves as his personal mount. And then he only has one magic item, interestingly enough, which is the Destroyer of Khorne. Now, the Destroyer, most art has it as like a really big axe, though whether he wields it one hand or two hand, it just kind of depends on which version of him you're looking at. But it's a really big axe that is a gift from the Blood God, and it is said there is only one in all of existence. And the Destroyer is gifted by Khorne to his most favored champion. So only one entity is capable of wielding it at a time, and Arbaal has had it for millennia. Now, the downside that comes with the Destroyer is that Khorne's attention is on Arbaal almost always. And there is a curse that is built in with the Destroyer, where if Arbaal should ever be defeated or flee from battle, Khorne will essentially strike him down, and he will immediately devolve into a chaos spawn. Now, I suspect he is probably not going to have that mechanic in Total War Warhammer, assuming he's not unbreakable, which I don't think he'll be unbreakable because he's not in his original profiles. But that would be kind of a shitty debuff to have on a character. So I'm curious how they're going to try and maybe work that angle where maybe he'll have something similar to Bretonnia, where his armies get benefits for like having Khorne's attention, but if they run away from battle and take penalties or something, who knows? But Valkia had a very similar system, and in Total War, they kind of just shoved it off to the side, where if people flee around Valkia and their friendly units, she would smite them for cowardice. But beyond that, like I said, I'm going to do a video in the coming days focusing just on Arbaal and talking really in depth about who he is and what they could do with him. But I think that he undeniably, I do not think it's even a contest, will be the Legendary Lord. He is just the biggest, baddest mortal character that Khorne has, and there's a lot of really fun history to him, and he shows up in a lot of really interesting places in Warhammer Fantasy, and even made an appearance in the End Times, which was cool. So that's our Legendary Lord. To our Legendary Hero, this would have been an interesting, difficult discussion if we turned the clock back before the Skulls event. But during Skulls, we got Khorne, which knocked out the only other contender for this slot besides Syla Anfringrim. So Syla Anfringrim is a Chaos Spawn special character, but he's not what you would probably necessarily think of when you think Chaos Spawn. A lot of people, when they think Chaos Spawn, tend to think like these horrible, like melted flesh-looking abominations that have like all sorts of crazy extra limbs and yada, yada, yada. Syla is very intimidating looking. He's a big, scary ape / lizard / man / dog thing. He's got a bunch of different parts, but he's essentially a big scary chaos spawn. And he's a fairly straightforward character. He was a great Norscan warlord who did a bunch of really amazing feats, but Khorne showered him with so many gifts for his various feats that he ended up getting too many. And like the vast majority of people that try to walk the path of champions or the path of ascension to become a demon prince, his body broke down, as did his mind, under the sheer weight of all his mutations. And he has since become a rabid beast that the only thing he ever says is that he just screams, "Kill for Khorne, kill for Khorne, kill for Khorne," over and over and over again. But he's got a really fun design, and I think will make for an excellent legendary hero that's just a large monstrous character. Not like, think like Throg-ish size, so like he's a monstrous beast size character, not like a really, really big monster. But should be excellent at just being hurled into lots of enemies and just absolutely obliterating his way through just about anything that's put in front of him. He's a pretty straightforward character, just has like a really nice stat line, he's really fast, and he only has one notable magic item, which is the Brass Collar of Khorne, though his is a little better than most of the collars you see in the game, where his makes him virtually immune to magic. He had the highest magic resistance you could possibly get in the game, so presumably he'll have extremely high spell resistance. It also gave him a ward save, so it'll probably give him some damage resistance and stuff. And he doesn't have like much in the way of armor. He's a fairly low armor character, but he does have really thick scaly skin, so I could see them giving him decent armor and also like probably some pretty high missile resistance, because scaly skin is usually associated with high missile resistance in Total War. But yeah, I think Syla is a super duper easy shoe-in. And then the really nice thing about Syla is he makes for a good legendary hero, because you could never see him as a legendary lord, because he's just kind of this wandering creature that has no ability or interest in leading troops or even saying anything other than kill for Khorne. And he's just kind of like this running around chaotic monster. But so he serves really well for a legendary hero. And furthermore, you can have him in a bunch of different rosters very appropriately, because he's a Norscan and he is wielded, so to speak, or he's protected or attended to by his Norscan tribe. His tribe actually like takes care of him, and they treat him with extreme respect and stuff, but he's essentially their dog on a chain. So they wander around joining war hosts and bring Syla with them, who will then be unleashed on the enemy armies. But so you could have him as legendary hero for Norscan factions, for Khorne factions, and for appropriate Warriors of Chaos as well. So probably just, you know, the undivided Warriors of Chaos, Daniel probably, or Prince Yuri, the Demon Prince, and then Valkia. So I think he'll make a really solid option, just because he'll be available to a lot of really cool rosters. I know personally I was a little disappointed. I really like Kask from Nurgle, but I was personally a little disappointed that he's only for Tamarkan and doesn't get to be used by any of the other rosters. He's very selective in that case, which makes me really, really hope we'll get Valnir the Reaper eventually, so we can have a Nurgle legendary hero that's available to all the Nurgle factions at the bare minimum. But so that is our legendary lord and legendary hero. I feel like those are complete shoo-ins that are not really debatable. I will go ahead and get the free LC legendary character out of the way. If they choose Khorne to get the free LC legendary lord, I think it is going to be Skulltaker, beyond a shadow of a doubt. I don't think Skulltaker is as interesting / unique / dynamic as Arbaal is, where Arbaal gives us like this really big cavalry focused character with a unique mount, being that he can ride a fleshhound and he's got this like really fun history and all this stuff to him. Skulltaker is, for those who don't know, the most powerful of Khorne's bloodletters. So he is your Herald of Khorne special character. He's extremely badass. He's got a cape that's made of all the skulls of enemies that he's defeated. He is a specialized duelist that runs around challenging people. So he just shows up outside of certain settlements or upon battlefields and declares challenges and tries to get people to fight him. And he has a whole gimmick about how he likes to draw out battles and slowly but surely rip people apart. And then he literally grabs their skulls and burns all the flesh away and rips it off with his bare hands to take to Khorne. But some of them he keeps for himself on his cape, and some of them he gives to the Blood God and adds to the throne. but he's a very, very cool character, and I think will make for an excellent legendary lord. But I consider him very much like Epidemius, where Epidemius was a fantastic addition, and I think much needed for Nurgle's roster to get him to that really nice 3 legendary lords. And I feel the same for Skulltaker and Arbaal, where my personal goal is to get each of the mono god factions to 3 legendary lords. If we can get them up to 3 each, I think that's great, where they get 1 mortal follower, 1 greater demon, and 1 lesser demon. If you can hit that, I think they're in a really, really good place. So for Khorne, I think doing Arbaal and Skulltaker is the goal, but Skulltaker should be the free LC character because he's pretty similar to a lot of characters we currently have. All right, and then from there, we can move on to the generic characters. So I lied earlier, unintentionally. This part is hard. This is exceptionally difficult, beyond difficult, in my opinion, to guess accurately who is going to be the generic lord and heroes for Khorne. Because, to put it very bluntly, Khorne's pretty basic. He's not really that interesting compared to the other gods because he doesn't use wizards. So, because you cut out an entire role of characters, his Warhammer Fantasy roster was always notably smaller than that of his fellow gods, because he doesn't have any of the wizard characters. So you had a melee lord, a melee hero, and that's it. that's all you got with him. And we already have those in Total War Warhammer, where we already have the Chaos Lord of Khorne and the Exalted Hero of Khorne. So we have that. What could we still do? And this takes us to an interesting place where you could argue that they could just do more melee characters. You could do like a champion of Khorne, and like an arch hero or whatever of Khorne, but I think that would be really lame and stupid. To be frank, I think you want something that fulfills a different role. So it's, okay, we already have like infantry-sized characters that can also be upgraded to ride on chariots or like monstrous creatures like the Juggernauts and, cavalry and stuff. So we don't need that. So I think the 2 realistic options are that they either can try and get away with stealing a page from the Age of Sigmar book, which Age of Sigmar did a brilliant job of expanding all the Chaos Gods, to be honest. They were so much more interesting than they were in Fantasy, and as far as their rosters are concerned, at least. And for Khorne, he got a bunch of priest characters. So you got Slaughter Priests, and all these different kinds of priest characters that use different forms of rituals to use prayers in order to manifest various miracles of Khorne upon the battlefield. So they're able to like buff units or hurt enemies or change the battlefield in some way and stuff like that. So think like a warrior priest in Total War Warhammer, or you could debate maybe like a runesmith or something in that category. But for Khorne, I think that would be a perfectly appropriate option, and you could just make a Lord and Hero version and it would be super duper simple. However, I will say that I worry, to be very blunt, that Games Workshop has been very, very active in the last 1 to 2 years on really hovering over what Creative Assembly is doing and telling them no on a lot of things. So in the past, they were much more like just whatever and just letting Creative Assembly do whatever they want, which I think led to some CA making a fair number of mistakes where I wish Games Workshop had been much more involved and had corrected some of CA's errors as far as like certain designs and like the way they went with a couple of DLCs. But for the most part, CA's done a really, really good job. And now we're on the flip side of it, where CA has been trying to do some really cool things, and Games Workshop has sort of been hovering in the background being like, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. And the thing that seems to be the most reliable predictor of this is that Games Workshop is quite frankly telling Creative Assembly that there is a very big difference between Age of Sigmar and Warhammer Fantasy, which I think is stupid and I hate it, but it's just the way Games Workshop is acting right now, to the point where the tabletop game is even more dramatically being impacted by this, where a good number of the factions are not allowed to be used in the different settings, despite those groups existing in the other settings, because Games Workshop hates the idea of Age of Sigmar and Fantasy having too much crossover. because they're stupid and idiots and dumbasses. But that is to say, I don't think, honestly, I don't think that Games Workshop will allow Creative Assembly to use Priest of Khorne in Warhammer Fantasy. Because I think that Games Workshop is going to turn around and say, nope, that is an Age of Sigmar thing. Just like Zongors with beaks are an Age of Sigmar thing, and like all of those Zongor things that we could have gotten, as far as like the shamans and the Zongor Enlightened, where they're like riding disc, or the Zongor Skyfires, where they've got like bows and stuff. I think Games Workshop very bluntly looks at that and says, no, that's Age of Sigmar. You cannot have that. This is the exact same reason why I think the Wrathmongers and the Skull Reapers will not be in Total War ever. Same thing for the Putrid Blight Kings. I think that Games Workshop purely considers those to be Age of Sigmar faction stuff, not Total War Warhammer. And we've seen that being reinforced over and over again by GW. So if we can't have the Priests of Khorne, which I think would be cool, I think they would be very unique, having like purely dedicated support characters who can build up to like, riding on they can ride on like war shrines or juggernauts or do some other things. I think those would be perfectly great as being like your sorcerer analog, so to speak. But if we can't have those, then what can we have? And I think the option here is to go the Beastman route and to have the Doom Bull of Khorne and the Gore Bull of Khorne. Now, I realize that initially you might look at that and go, but they would be fairly different than what we have now, of being characters that they are big, monstrous infantry type characters. So they immediately are separated from your Chaos Lord and your Exalted Hero, and that you're starting off with monstrous characters that can have a unique focus, where it's like, if your Chaos Lord of Khorne is maybe anti-infantry or has a spec into just armor piercing, then you get a Doom Bull that is spec'd into a different trait. So maybe he's anti-infantry if the Khorne Lord isn't, or maybe he's anti-large. And then the same thing for the Gore Bull, where you look at the Exalted Hero and go, okay, what does this guy do? What does this guy really bring to the table? And the Gore Bull does something different. So he's anti-large, where the Exalted Hero is anti-infantry, so to speak. And where the Chaos Lord and the Exalted Hero are very, very heavily armored, the Beastmen, the Minotaur characters are trade out armor for speed, larger health pools, and just hitting like an absolute beef stick on the charge. So I will say that my personal preference would be for Games Workshop to be willing to allow CA to run ahead with the Priest idea, because that would be really, really fun and it would stick out and be something truly unique. And if we can't have that, then I think going the Minotaur route would be fine, because we already have the Minotaurs of Khorne as kind of like a unique version of the Beastmen that Khorne has. I do very strongly feel that the Minotaurs of Khorne should be available to the Beastmen as well. It should be added to the Beastmen roster. I don't like, if they can have Centaurs of Tzeentch, I see no reason why they can't have Minotaurs of Khorne. So I would very much say let's also have those over there. If we get the characters, though, I could see those being Khorne exclusive. I would love to have them in the Beastmen roster, but I could see the argument of like, oh, well, why would I ever take the regular undivided versions? So the Khorne versions maybe could be unique to Khorne. Alternatively, maybe Tarox could uniquely have access to the Khorne versions instead of the undivided versions. But I could see maybe who knows, they can introduce marked Beastman characters. That would be kind of cool. I don't see it happening, but it would be kind of cool. So with that out of the way, the generic characters, which like I said, is anybody's guess. Let's get on to units. So for the units, 4 of these I feel really, really good about. The last one, I've got a couple of options. So the first thing, and by far the easiest, are the Khorngors. We're going to get Khorngors. I don't think that's even a question. We've got our Zongors, we've got our Pestigors, so I think Khorngors are an easy shoo-in. I have no idea how they're going to be represented. Where we got Zongors with sword and board, and they're more, they got the barriers, so they're more kind of a unique tanky unit. And then the Pestigors have like a large health pool and some really cool debuff mechanics, but they wield like big great axes, so they're armor piercing. So like, what could the Khorngors bring to the party that would be something different from what we already have and would be good for the Khorne roster and the Beastman roster? And the answer is, I have no idea. Traditionally, they're represented as a great weapon unit, but I feel like the Pestigors kind of already fulfill that niche. But you could, have them maybe be like, oh, they've got great weapons, but they've got anti-infantry, or they've got great weapons, but they've got anti-large. So they act as kind of like not a halberd unit, because they don't have any of the defensive aspects of halberds, but like an aggressive halberd unit. So they have anti-large, and they're really big about like getting into the fray and getting in there and tearing people apart and fighting, but they don't have like charge defense against large or charge reflection or any of that other stuff. I think that could be one potential interesting route to go with it, but I know we're going to get Khorngors. I just don't know exactly what form they're going to take, where, they could have like twin axes, or they could have great axes, or maybe some other weird variant. But I really look forward to seeing them. I was personally extremely happy with the Pestigors, and I do really like the Zongors. It's like, personally, I think the Age of Sigmar ones are slightly cooler, but I do like the Total War ones, certainly. So Khorngors, that's an easy shoo-in. The next one that I think is likely, even though it's, in my opinion, going to need a better name, are the Chariots of Khorne. So the Chariots of Khorne, for those who are unaware, are a Storm of Chaos unit, which Creative Assembly has been doing a really good job of taking quite literally everything from the Storm of Chaos book and porting it into Total War Warhammer, which I think is very appropriate. The Chariots of Khorne are different than what we already have in the game, because you might look and go, Chariots of Khorne, like we already have Khorne chariots, like we have the regular Chaos chariot, and we even have a Gore-Beast Chariot of Khorne. So why would a Chariot of Khorne be different, especially when we have things like the Skull Cannon and the Blood Throne? And the answer to that is that, where the Gore-Beast Chariot of Khorne and the Chariot of Khorne are mortal units, so they are crewed by humans and they have mortal rules and abilities, the Chariot of Khorne is a demonic unit. So it's crewed by bloodletters and it's pulled by demons, being juggernauts. Now, the really cool thing about the Chaos Chariot of Khorne is that it's this big, nasty, frenzied chariot that could be pulled by one juggernaut, or you could upgrade it so that it's pulled by two juggernauts. And I think that would actually make for a genuinely interesting model within the game. You get a chariot dedicated to the blood god and you go, oh, how do I make this stand out? Because like a Gore-Beast chariot and a chariot pulled by a juggernaut feel like they'd be kind of the same. And my answer would be two juggernauts, because that would make it substantially larger than any of the other chariots that you see in the entire Chaos roster. Like even the Slaanesh chariots, which get pretty wide, you get like the Exalted Seeker chariots and stuff where they're pulled by like 4 steeds of Slaanesh. So they're quite a bit broader and larger and stuff. This is the exact same thing, where you have this hardcore heavy metal chariot pulled by 2 big fucking juggernauts with bloodletters on the back being like, ah, with their hellblades. So I think that would make for an excellent new unit, because that would give Khorne a heavy chariot specialist. And you could either make it where it's a singular model, like I can't remember which one of the Slaanesh chariots. If I recall correctly, you get like less models than with the others, because it's like larger and has more of a specialization role. But I think it'd make for a really fun unit. You just make it super heavily armored. It's got demons. So, it's demonic instability, so it's that pseudo-unbreakable, and you could even give it the Hellblade buff, where if it gets enough kills, it gets a permanent buff for the rest of the battle. That's usually saved for Exalted Bloodletters, but I think putting Exalted Bloodletters on the chariot would make it that much more exciting. Make it a really elite unit. You want this to be your big boy chariot for Khorne. So I would put Exalted Bloodletters on it, give them the Hellblade ability where if they get enough kills, they get like the big damage upgrade for the rest of the battle, and have it pulled by 2 Juggernauts instead of 1. Because that'll really help separate it from the Gore-Beast Chariot, where it's like, oh, if I take Gore-Beast Chariots, I get a unit of like monstrous cavalry-sized, the big Gore-Beast gorilla monsters pulling the chariot. Whereas if I go the demonic route, I get the Chariot of Khorne, which probably could use a more exciting name. Like, I don't know, like I feel like it's like we got the Blood Throne, so like I feel like calling it a Blood Chariot is a little goofy, but the bloodletters on juggernauts are blood crushers. So like blood seems to be the naming convention. So it feels like it should be blood something of Khorne or just a blood something. But I don't know. Someone in the comments come up with some cool names for them. But anyway, so new big chariot model. The third thing, which I think is also a insane shoe-in, like this is by far, like it's gonna be in the roster, is the Slaughter Brute. So the Slaughter Brutes are these big, horrible monsters, and this is gonna be the big boy monster for Khorne. So like everything else I'm gonna talk about is like not gigantic, you know, it's reasonably sized. But the Slaughter Brute is a really, really, really big, hardcore, killy-focused monster that has a lot of limbs. I think it has 6 limbs, if I remember, because it's got these little T-Rex arms under its chest. But it's the like alternative version to the Mutalith Vortex Beast. It's going to be roughly the same size as the Mutalith Vortex Beast. But where the Mutalith Vortex Beast is all about like magic and like weird abilities and debuffs and like all this other stuff, the Slaughter Brute is just pure carnage. It is a heavily armored, because of all like the scaly skin stuff, monster with these big old arms that just go around and just brutally massacre people, and it's got like 3 tongues and it bites people in half, and it's just a big, horrible, scary monster. And very similar to the Mutalith Vortex Beast, the Mutalith Vortex Beast canonically is not a Tzeentch model. It is just an undivided creature. The Slaughter Brute is the exact same way, but where it's technically undivided. But I think anybody looks at the Mutalith Vortex Beast and goes, okay, that seems very Tzeentchy. And so they put it in the Tzeentch DLC, and I think everyone went, yeah, that makes sense. Same thing with the Cockatrice. Undivided creature, but, you know, it's like, oh, it's got the appropriate color schemes, and it's a big bird. So, like, yeah, sure, that's Tzeentch. Fine, cool. But it's also available to undivided stuff as well. I would do the same thing with the Slaughter Brute, where you get the Slaughter Brute, and if it's part of the Khorne roster, it gets the Mark of Khorne and all the big Khorne upgrades, but it should also be available to the Undivided Warriors of Chaos roster, because it is also just a regular undivided big beastie. But as far as what the Slaughter Brute really brings to the table, it's just a hardcore, I'm going to kill everything in front of me specialist. It had some really weird rules in tabletop where it had a really nice stat line, but the goal for it was that at the start of the game, you had to bind it to one of your lords or heroes. And basically what that would do is that your character, the lord or hero in question, would be allowed to use their weapon skill for the monster. So basically the Slaughter Brute would get an extremely high stat line when it came to fighting for a monster. You know, most monsters in the game were like weapon skill 3 or weapon skill 4, but if you tied it to a Chaos Lord, you could have like a weapon skill 8 or 9 Slaughter Brute running around, which made it insanely good at dishing out hits and avoiding getting hit, which made it pretty spooky. But the downside to it is that if the character that it was bound to died, then the Slaughter Brute would become unbound, which meant that it would go frenzy and it would literally move in random directions. And if it hit a friendly unit, it would deal like a ton of damage to the friendly units that it ran into. So it became like this uncontrollable, crazy creature, because it has like a bunch of ritual scarring on its back that's carved in with ritual daggers, and swords get impaled into its back to make an 8-pointed star. And then the character controlling it takes like has their blood put on all of these swords. So it's a binding ritual to bind the creature to the Chaos Lord in question. So I don't know exactly how they're going to represent that in Total War. I think the way to do it that would be the most like fun to play with is you give the Slaughter Brute probably an ability, like a passive, where if it's within like 35 to 55 meters of a friendly lord or hero, it gets a bunch of buffs. So like if it's fighting nearby a friendly character, it gets a whole bunch of really cool buffs, and it's like immune to the rampage effect. Like it can't rampage, and maybe it gets like a really fat buff to its melee attack and melee defense to make it like a much more skilled combatant. But if there are no characters nearby, then it is vulnerable to the rampage rule, the reworked rampage rule that we have nowadays, and it also has like notably less melee attack and melee defense because the buff isn't active. I think that would probably be the easiest way to represent it, but I do think it's going to be an exceptionally cool model, and it's going to be a really big, giant, stompy monster, which is always super fun, and we love to see it. And that's going to be Khorne's big monster for this DLC, which I think every race should get at least one big monster for this particular DLC, though we'll talk about the others on future videos. So then we get on to the fourth option, and I think there's a really, really solid choice for this, which is a low to medium tier monster, and that is the Giant Spined Chaos Beast. So the Giant Spined Chaos Beast has kind of been hovering around, I think, in the zeitgeist of the Total War community for a hot minute, because when the Total War Warhammer 3 art book was released, we got to, frankly, see that the Giant Spined Chaos Beast is in the artwork, along with the Chimera. Both of those monsters apparently were considered for Total War Warhammer 3, but for whatever reason didn't make the cut. And I think this would be the appropriate time to pick up the Giant Spine Chaos Beast off the cutting room floor and restore it to the game as a fully playable model. Now, you might ask, well, what the hell is a Giant Spine Chaos Beast? And the question is, it's basically a monster-sized Chaos Warhound. It is a Chaos Warhound that ventures too close to the realms of chaos in the north, where reality falls away and there's like mutagenic magical energies just pouring out of the North Pole. And they stay in this area for too long, and it causes them to mutate horrifically and to swell in size until they turn into these big, horrible monsters. And the Giant Spine Chaos Beasts are really fun. They're nasty-looking creatures, but the whole gimmick to them is that their muscles are constantly growing and shifting. So their skin is like splitting in a bunch of places because their muscles are constantly like causing their flesh to tear and then regenerating to tear and stuff. And it also, they have like spines constantly like emerging and poking out of their flesh until they grow all the way out, and then they fall out, and then new ones start pouring out. And their teeth, they have like these horrible, I'll make sure that artwork's showing up for everything I'm talking about today. But their teeth are like protruded outwards in this really uncomfortable, gross looking way. And their teeth are constantly growing, like they're always growing in size, until new teeth start pushing up from underneath those old fangs, and they push those teeth out, kind of like with a shark. But for the Giant Spine Chaos Beast, it's agony. Like, it is perpetually in horrible agony because it just feels all of these like bones and muscles constantly growing and shifting, and like, you know, it's in terrible pain all the time. And they're noted for being horrifically brutal, bloodthirsty creatures, because the only time they're alleviated from their suffering is when they're quite literally feasting on flesh or killing something. So though, like, unleashing violence is the only thing that brings them a moment's peace. So they're these incredibly aggressive, brutal creatures that are constantly seeking out to tear things apart. And even notes, like, because of the way their jaws are designed, where their jaws are like pushed outwards, their like core strategy when they're not eating like people, because they can easily eat a man in one bite, is that they like they're like wolves, where they jump at larger creatures and bite their teeth into it and just lock their jaws and just start shaking their necks as hard as they can and trying to twist to like pull big chunks of flesh off. They're like horribly gross, super cool creatures. The really nice thing about them is they're not super duper massive. Like, they're big, you know, they're large creatures, but they're not, you know, nearly as large as like a Slaughter Brute or a Dreadsaurian or anything like that. You know, they're more, I would consider them more like your Frostworm, after the Frostworm got its rework for Kislev, where it is a monster, but it's not a gigantic monster, you know, more like your Stegodon size, your Frostworm size. So, you know, it's not up there with like the Elemental Bear or the Dreadsaurian or any of those. It's in the kind of the normal big monster category. As far as what special rules it brings to the table, it actually has quite a few really fun ones. The first is that it would have melee damage reflection. It had a special rule quite literally called Spiky, which made it where if you're in melee with it, it has, you know, you have a chance of getting impaled on its various spikes that cover it kind of like a porcupine. So it would have melee damage reflection as one of its rules, which is a really good ability to have. It has regeneration, which is very exciting. So, you know, just a regular monster for the Warriors of Chaos that has regen. Very, very cool. It's very fast because it's a very heavily mutated Chaos Warhound, so it's extremely quick running across the battlefield. But it's a nasty beast. Its melee attack and melee defense would probably be kind of garbo, but it would have really solid weapon strength, probably pretty decent armor, a very large health pool, regeneration. Interestingly, it doesn't cause terror; it only causes fear. So that's the big thing I mean when I say it's not like a massive monster. It's a good sized monster, but it's not. Oh, never mind. It does cause terror. Ignore me. I thought I read fear, but what I actually was reading was frenzy. So it's frenzied. It causes terror, it regens, and it even has Swift Stride. So I don't know if they're going to, presumably, hopefully they'll give it Swift Stride as well in Total War, which means that no terrain will slow it down. It will ignore penalties from terrain and just move at its constant movement. So this thing's going to be fast, regenerating, really solid health pool. It's a terror causer, and it, frenzy. So it's going to be really good, big, aggressive monster. I imagine its leadership is going to be probably not the best, but probably not terrible, but not the best. But I think it'll make for a good medium-sized monster for Khorne. Now, because it's basically just a big warhound, in tabletop, you could give it marks for all 4 of the Chaos Gods. So you could make it available to every single Chaos roster, and that would be totally fine. Or you could go with what Total War has done, where it's only available to the rosters that have Chaos Warhounds. So it could be available to the Beastmen, Warriors of Chaos, Khorne, and Nurgle. Because those are the rosters that have Chaos Warhounds. And it's just a big, heavily mutated Chaos Warhound. I think that would be totally fine. But you could also just give it to all of them because it also was available for all of them. So I think either option is totally fine. So that takes us through all of the super duper duper easy options. I think those are all things that we're definitely undeniably going to get. Except for, the whole speech I gave with the generic characters. Generic characters are a little more confusing. But that leaves us with the 5th option. And to be frank, this one's really tricky because there's nothing that I think is like, oh yeah, that is so Khorne. Like, that is the most corny Khorne thing I've ever seen in my life. I want milk with those cornflakes type unit. There are a lot of things you could do. I think they're all great options, but they're all equally good in their different ways. So, like, if you wanted to take a unit, like, let's say from the Storm of Chaos, if you wanted a new Storm of Chaos unit that would act as a new infantry unit for Khorne, you could pull out the Flayerkin. Now, I have talked about the Flayerkin before when I talked about Norska, because I think the Flayerkin would work really well for Norska, but basically they are humans. In the original story, they are humans that Archaon traded to Clan Moulder, and Clan Moulder put them through, like, horrible, mutagenic experiments and grafting surgeries, and made them into like weaponized siege, like living siege weapons, and then sent them back. So they're humans that have like pickaxes for like their hands have been cut off, and they have like pickaxes and blades and stuff inserted into like their stumps. So they're able to scale walls by just like climbing them. And they also have like a bunch of chains embedded into their backs that just hang because like barbed chains. Because the idea behind it from Clan Moulder was that they would start climbing the walls, and if they get killed while climbing, the hooks that they have, the Flayerkin's hooks, would like embed in the walls, and they die and just hang there. And the chains off their back would allow other warriors and other fighters to grab onto the chains and use their corpses to like scale the walls, which is pretty horrific imagery, which is super duper fun. But they had really nightmarish artwork. I'll make sure to have some posted up. They got used quite heavily when Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning returned. In a couple of dungeons, they featured rather prominently in the game and got some really cool new designs. But those could work really well, where they're these nightmarish dual weapon infantry. You could put them in Norska, you could put them in Khorne. Once again, though, they're not purely corny. They're an undivided unit, but you could make them work quite easily. So that's one option. Another option would be for like shield maidens. So we know that Valkia is literally a Valkyrie, right? She's just ripped straight from that concept and slapped into Warhammer. But Valkia, when she was mortal, was a shield maiden of Khorne, and there is kind of a theme running around certain aspects of Khornate culture within the lore, where you'll often find these really powerful female champions of Khorne who emulate Valkia and will form these kind of like shield maiden type warriors. So you could do something like aspiring champions, so to speak, where you have like a really small group of 12, or like a really small elite unit of like these female berserker type warriors who specialize in emulating Volkia. So maybe they wield spears like she does, and they have shields like she does, and they're like super duper nasty elite warriors of Khorne, who are exceptionally good at killing all sorts of different things, and they maybe have some kind of buff ability where they inspire nearby units, just like we kind of see with aspiring champions, but taken to like, a whole nother level. So that's an option. You could do the Chaos Siege Giant of the Chaos Dwarfs. So the Chaos Siege Giant is a giant that, very similar to the Flayerkin, has had its hands chopped off and replaced with like giant hooks and pickaxes and stuff. And its body is also covered in chains, but its body is encased almost entirely in armor. So they're very, very heavily armored giants that are specialized to tear down fortifications, but they're also really fucking good at killing other monsters. Because, if you're good at like gutting out walls and slamming down foundations, then planting your pickaxe to like, smash the kneecaps of an enemy monster, or using your big gouging claws to like stab into them and rip out their intestines and stuff. Pretty similar system. And that would also give the Chaos Dwarfs a new unit that they're missing, which would be quite nice. That would be a really exciting addition for the Chaos Dwarfs as well. I will say that I am a bit biased though, and I have my personal choice for this 5th slot. My personal choice would be actually to do the Praeton, because to be very blunt, I don't think the Beastmen are ever gonna get a DLC. Again, like, I think the Beastmen are going to benefit from other people's DLCs, which they've been doing a really good job of. And I think there's a very realistic chance that hopefully Creative Assembly will do character packs where there's no new units, it's just new characters, where we'll get things like Goros Warhoof, Moonclaw, and a lot of those characters we really want to see for the Beastmen. But I just don't see them getting any actual units, because pretty much all the things they're missing are showing up in these Monogod DLCs. So this could be a good opportunity for the Praeton, which, for those that don't know, the Praeton is kind of similar to, like, it's in the like Wyvern, Manticore, Griffin class of monster, where it's a flying medium-sized monster, but it is a horrible creature that is just the most hateful, brutal, blood-frenzied thing that exists. There are myths and legends about the Praetons, which are heavily implied to be very true, where they used to be the beautiful great stags of the deep forest that like the wood elves have, but they were captured by the Beastmen and were twisted through horrible profane rituals in front of herdstones into these nightmarish creatures known as Praetons, which from a very long distance in deep forest foliage look like a stag that's maybe in terrible pain, but when you get close to it, you very quickly realize it is nothing. It is not a stag. They are like covered in like scaly flesh. They have big wings coming out of their front legs. They have these like big long tails, and their horns, instead of being like stag antlers, are like serrated like blades and a little bit thicker. And they have like big wolf's fangs, like really big sharp teeth. And they are brutal creatures. They are considered to be manifestations of hatred and malice, which, come on, Khorne, hate, they go together real well. And their whole gimmick is that they're extremely fast mid-tier monsters that can fly around. They're specialized at forest fighting, so they have the Forest Strider special rule. And they're very nasty on the charge. They had impact hit, so they would have a really high charge bonus. They fly, which provides a really fun thing for Khorne. They had a couple of really cool rules. One of the things they had that I found particularly interesting is that they have two rules called Endless Malice and Consuming Hatred. So not only did they have the hate special rule, but they had the Consuming Hate special rule, which meant that as they took damage, it made them, like, they hate everything so much that they even hate themselves and what they become, because they're twisted monsters. And so the Praetons take pleasure in the destruction of their own bodies, of people attacking them and tearing them apart. And some Praetrons are even known for literally tearing themselves apart because they get like a twisted form of satisfaction from it. So they could have a really unique special rule where as they're taking damage, it adds to their leadership. Because that's essentially how it worked in the tabletop game, was that if the Praeton takes any wounds, it would get to count its own wounds that it has taken to its side for combat resolution instead of just for the enemy side. So they were exceptionally difficult to break from combat because if you were hurting them, they were gaining benefits from it. So it could allow for a really unique rule, maybe like a fill-upable meter, kind of like we see with like Norska's Berserker rule, where like the longer you're in combat, the meter fills up and you get bonuses. Doing something with the Praeton as well could be really fun, where maybe based on the amount of damage it's taken or just the time it's spent in combat being attacked by enemies, it has a meter that fills up and it gets bonus leadership for, you know, the amount of damage it's taken. So it could be uniquely it's not unbreakable. You know, there are things that break in and it can be affected by other leadership modifiers, like being attacked in the rear or isolated and surrounded by stronger opponents. Like, you know, there's a lot of different leadership modifiers, but it would be interesting if it was like relatively immune to the leadership modifiers from taking damage. And you could make it like a timed thing where like maybe it only lasts for a certain amount of seconds. But I think it'd be fine if it was just infinite time and it just had a very unique gimmick of that just dealing damage to it was not actually a way to ideally break it from combat. You had to rely on other methods. It causes terror, which is super duper nice. And then for its Endless Malice rule, the unique thing about a Praeton is that Endless Malice was a very unique gimmick, where instead of when an enemy unit would break from combat, instead of the Praeton chasing them down and finishing them off, the Praeton would just start like mindlessly and frenziedly just ripping apart the corpses of the people it had killed and just tearing them to absolute oblivion because it would be so lost in its hate and frenzy and its bloodlust. And so because of that, enemy units were always guaranteed to get away from it. However, it would cause panic checks for all enemies within like 10 inches, which is a really big area of effect back in those days of Warhammer. Because they're seeing this horrifying display of this monster just brutally savaging all of their allies' corpses and being like, oh my god, it's horrible. So it could have a really, really fun special rule where if there's like an enemy unit like if it's attacking an enemy unit that's broken or is routing, it could cause a leadership debuff to other units within like 35 meters. So it could be really, really good for if you use it appropriately. It has the ability to specialize in causing chain reactions of routing from combat. Because if you throw it in at an enemy unit and they start breaking and fleeing from combat, especially because it causes terror, so it could terror route an enemy. If it attacks a unit that it's routing, it unleashes an ability, an aura ability of 35 meters where it starts causing leadership debuffs to nearby foes. I think that would be a really, really cool special rule. It would make for a fun mechanic that if you could utilize properly, could make it a really specialized terror bomber, where it just goes in, causes terror on one unit, attacks them, causing a leadership debuff to other units nearby, who then are also possible to get terrified, and it could be really, really fun to play around with. On top of that, it's got like skin type stuff, so it could have good missile resistance. It wouldn't have very high armor. Like it has scaly flesh, but it's not very well armored. So it'd probably be relatively low in the armor category, probably around like, 40 to 50 or 60. But could have good missile resistance for its scaly skin, maybe like 35% to make it where it doesn't get shot down too easily. And then it has Frenzy, which is great. So it has the Frenzy special rule. So before it breaks, it gets like bonuses to its damage and melee attack and all that stuff. And then last but certainly not least, you get the Forest Stalker special rule on it. So it has the Woodsman ability, so it doesn't take penalties from forests, and it can even have Vanguard deployment. So I think that would make for an excellent unit that is very Khorne themed and would be a really unique new beast to have in the Khorne roster, and it makes for a good medium tier beast. Its leadership is not that great. To be frank, its armor isn't that great. It had a pretty okay stat line, but it performed a really interesting role with its various abilities, rules the fact that it can fly and is very fast. And even though it doesn't necessarily have very good leadership, the idea that it gains leadership as it takes damage could be a really fun play on the low monster leadership trope that I think would be super fun. And I would have it available to Khorne and the Beastmen. I would not have it available to the Warriors of Chaos. I think it should be Khorne and Beastmen only. Granted, I think CA tends to be a little slightly lazy when it comes to applying the monogod units to like what rosters they're available to. Sometimes you get to see weird units show up in the Warriors of Chaos roster that really shouldn't be there, in my opinion. But I think this would be a good example of a creature. And granted, I could see them being like, we're just going to put it in the gifts section so that, like, if you do the gift of Khorne, you can get Pratons out of it. But it should primarily, in my opinion, be for the Khorne and Beastman roster. But I think this would be a really good time for the Praeton. So to just go over it all very simply one last time, my prediction right now for the Khorne roster is you get Arbaal the Undefeated as your featured legendary lord, Syla and Aningrim as your featured legendary hero for Khorne, Warriors of Chaos, and Norska. Then for Lord and Hero, you're probably going to get the Doom Bull and the Gore Bull, though I am personally hoping that Games Workshop will allow them to use some kind of priests, because getting prayers for Khorne would be super fucking awesome and really cool, and they could make some really fun effects. And then for units, I am predicting the Khorne Gore, the Chariot of Khorne, which needs a better name, the Slaughter Brute, the Giant Spine Chaos Beast, and the Praeton. With the Giant Spine Chaos Beast being like a mid to large monster, the Praeton being a mid-sized monster, and the Slaughter Brute being a large monster. Yeah, so please let me know what you think of my predictions down in the comment section below. I will be doing my best to try and have some dialogue with you guys down there about like potential ideas and thoughts and stuff. And just a reminder that I'll have some later videos coming out this week where I'm going to focus like just on Arbaal and what I think his mechanics and systems could be. We'll do a video on Syla, and we'll do a video on Skulltaker as well as an alternative choice, but also I am hoping the free LC Legendary Lord for Khorne. So thank you very much for watching this video. We'll be talking more about Khorne throughout the upcoming days. And then once we get through all the Khorne goodness, we'll be moving on to the Ogre Kingdoms. So please stay tuned. I am very, very excited for this DLC and can't wait to hear more about it in the coming months. But until then, please take care. Have a lovely day. I appreciate you all very much for watching. Thank you very much to all my patrons and stuff and everyone. And I will see you all again very soon.